Tomorrow is likely to be a remarkably important day, and our viewers need to understand the consequences. So, Professor Tribe, let me start with you. Many Supreme Court watchers pretty much predicted that the justices would wait until in fact, Judge Luttig predicted the same thing. They would wait probably until the very last day of this term to issue its opinion on Trump's immunity claim. But it didn't have to be this way. What's your sense of the delay? What do you expect to happen, and what consequence do you expect to follow, regardless of what the Supreme Court's opinion may be?
Well, thanks for having me on, Ali. It's quite clear that the court's delay was deliberate. They could have resolved the case by simply letting the extraordinarily comprehensive opinion of the D.C. Circuit stay unaffected. They could have agreed to leapfrog that case the way they do in another set of circumstances. They could have decided this case as far back as last December. The argument was over 60 days ago. It was on April 25th. They have slow walked it. There's no reason to, because the claim that any person in this country, president or not, has absolute immunity when he tries to overturn an election and prevent the transition of power is absurd. I can't imagine that the Supreme Court will take that position. Rather, what it is likely to do is muddy the waters by pointing out that just last week in the Fisher case, it put limits on the reach of the statute involving obstructing an official proceeding, which is one of the criminal statutes that the special counsel has invoked in his election interference indictments. It's not the only one. There are also statutes about defrauding the United States and stealing people's votes. But the obstruction statute, as the majority opinion by Chief Justice Roberts pointed out, is now not quite as broad-reaching as the language would suggest. Justice Barrett, in her brilliant dissenting opinion last Friday, said that the court had to do textual flips over and over again, acrobatics, in order to avoid reading the word otherwise, where it says otherwise obstructing a proceeding, to mean not otherwise, but by the same means. Now, that's getting technical, but the bottom line is that there will be an open question after whatever the court decides tomorrow on the immunity issue. One open question that I think has been clear to the court ever since the day it heard argument in this case, which was the day after it heard argument in an important other case. The open question is whether the manipulation of electoral ballots and the interference with those ballots and the conspiracy to forge and alter electoral certificates is sufficiently like the evidence tampering that the court says is the heart of the obstruction statute. Now, analogies are always difficult, and I can imagine the D.C. Circuit or Judge Chutkan on remand struggling with that question of resemblance, whereas if Justice Barrett's position had prevailed, and she was joined by Justices Sotomayor and Kagan, it would be an open and shut case that this did involve obstruction of an official proceeding. The other open question is going to be whether whatever immunity the court finds for former presidents, and there might be immunity for some core exercise of presidential power like the pardon power, whatever immunity it finds is not going to cover 99% of what the president is charged with having done. And the task of separating the wheat from the chaff, identifying which things the president is charged with having done, avoid whatever immunity the court finds exists, that task could lead to further proceedings in the lower courts, further clarifying the virtual impossibility of trying the case to verdict before the election. But the silver lining, and I'll try to keep this very short, the silver lining is that if there is a hearing in the lower court, that doesn't have to be a hearing that is held off for over 80 days, the way Judge Chutkan said the trial would have to be held off even if she's given a green light. That hearing could occur next week. And at that hearing, which could continue through the election season, the evidence about what the president is charged with having done in the plot to overturn the election will be laid before the American people, who have undoubtedly either not seen or have forgotten the evidence gathered by the January 6th committee. And that would be the upside of a rather complicated ruling.
So this is good, because now we're getting into some meat here, and Judge Luttig, who alerted me, by the way, to your article on this. Thank you, Judge, for doing that. This is the work of judges and lawyers to try and figure out. So Matthew Seligman, who co-authored the brief that Professor Tribe signed on to, Judge Luttig, has written in it, no one disputes. Wrote an opinion piece for MSNBC in which he said, no one disputes that the electoral count is an official proceeding, and no one could deny that electoral certificates are, quote, records, documents, objects, or other things used, end quote, in the electoral count. So the only question is whether the defendant impaired the availability or integrity of the electoral certificates for use in the electoral count. If the defendant we're talking about is Donald Trump, and Professor Tribe is correct that this hearing on this matter could go forward, what effect would that have on the totality of Donald Trump being held responsible for trying to overturn an election?